Welcome to the Egg Whisperer Show, a podcast exclusively designed to create more reproductive health awareness and discuss your fertility preservation options. Here is your host, the Harvard-educated fertility specialist, Dr. Amy.
Welcome to the Egg Whisperer Show. I'm very excited to have Lynn Jensen joining me today. Hi, Lynn.
Hi, nice to be here. I'm super excited to be on your show too. It's been really fun watching your interviews with some of my colleagues like Judy Simon and Dr. Laura Shaheen. And I just watched your interview with Dr. Lee Rubin, and she actually was one of the people who was almost single-handedly ensured the success of my Yoga for Fertility program when I started it 20 years ago, because she was sending all of her patients to my classes. So it was fun to see her interview.
And that's really special. I mean, we're all connected in this really amazing way. And I'm so glad that the universe brought you into my life now. So I think it was Judy that connected us, right?
Yes, that's right. It's great to be here.
Thank you. So we're going to talk about yoga for fertility. And can it really boost success rates? And that's what you're going to talk to us all about. And before we get into that, I want to share with our listeners and viewers a little bit more about you. Lynn created her Yoga for Fertility program in 2002 after dealing with her own fertility challenges. She's a registered yoga teacher and prenatal yoga teacher, as well as a certified yoga therapist, and holds a master teacher certification in energy medicine yoga. For the past decade, she has also taught yoga for women classes at Microsoft headquarters in Seattle. She's co-author of Yoga and Fertility, A Journey to Health and Healing, has presented at Resolve conferences, and taught in the Mind-Body program at Pacific Northwest Fertility in Seattle. There's no one better to talk to us about yoga and fertility than Lynn. So Lynn, I know you practice yoga while juggling a corporate career before launching your own business. What brought you to yoga?
I started practicing yoga when I was living in Japan in my mid-20s. I had always been an athlete and a runner. And when I got to this city in Japan, it really wasn't very practical to do those things. So I actually bought a book called Yoga for Runners. And I started doing yoga in my little apartment there in Japan. And then when I came back to the States to go to graduate school, I found a yoga teacher and just continued to practice. And really the yoga became such a lifeline for me when I started this really super stressful job. I was working for a software company. I was managing their international sales and marketing. So I was traveling like 70% of the time out of the country. And I was doing yoga in airports, in hotel rooms. Sometimes I would get off a flight from Singapore and go straight to yoga class from there. So it really was so helpful in that stressful lifestyle.
Yeah, and I hear that from my patients as well. So I'm glad you're here to talk to us about that. And how did your own fertility journey influence or impact how you teach?
We started to try for a family when I was in my early 30s, thinking that it would be easy, like everyone thinks. And it wasn't. In hindsight, it was probably totally crazy to try to conceive, given my work situation and the fact that I was out of the country most of the time. After several years of trying, we finally ended up doing like all of the things. We did IUIs, we did IVF cycles, I did a stretch on Lupron to try to control my endometriosis. We had a long journey with fertility, and it's actually helpful now because I understand what my students are going through, and because many students in my classes are doing fertility treatments. But during all of that, I was continuing to do my yoga practice regularly. And what I noticed was that I had a couple other friends who were going through similar fertility treatments at the time. And I just noticed that I was on a lot more even keel than they were with this fertility process. They would come back and tell me about things like bursting into tears in a meeting at work or yelling at their partner. And I just wasn't in that same emotional roller coaster that they were. In the end, our third and final IVF cycle didn't work. After about 6 years of trying to conceive, we switched gears and went to our next plan, which was to go down the adoption track. And when we did that, everything shifted, in fact. And 3 months later, I had my baby son. at home with us. So clearly that was the right track for us to be on. Then when he was about 2 and I could start to think again, I started to think about, in hindsight, the yoga practice that I was doing during all that time was a pretty strenuous practice and really wasn't the most supportive thing that I could have been doing from a fertility standpoint. So I started to think, even though I didn't end up conceiving, that the yoga was super helpful during the process. And could there be some kind of yoga that was specifically designed to help women who are trying to conceive? And so I started doing a lot of research around that. By this time, I was certified as a yoga teacher, and I put together a program which would be supportive for people who were trying to conceive. And so that's the program that I launched in 2002.
And I'd love to hear more about how and why can yoga help with fertility?
I don't necessarily think that all kinds of yoga are super helpful for fertility, because there's a lot of different brands of yoga out there and they have different goals. A lot of the yoga that's out there right now is things that I call it yoga aerobics, because it's get fit yoga, core power yoga. Those have really pretty different goals from yoga for fertility. If we're doing a kind of yoga practice that really is designed to specifically support fertility, then there are a lot of ways that yoga is going to help. So some of those are physically by increasing the blood flow and the energy flow to the pelvic area and the reproductive organs. Also, yoga supports the regulation of the endocrine system, helping to regulate hormone levels. We put a lot of emphasis in my classes on stress reduction and activating the parasympathetic nervous system and just helping people get out of that fight or flight mode, which a lot of people spend a lot of time in. Reducing the level of stress hormones, I think, is super important for anyone going through this process, because it's just a super stressful process, as we all know. And then finally, if it's a specific yoga for fertility class like my classes, we're actually modifying poses to some extent, depending on where someone is in their monthly cycle and whether they're in a treatment program or not. And then we also work on mental and emotional levels also, because yoga calms the mind. It reduces anxiety, which I find that a lot of my students have a lot of anxiety. It's been shown to increase levels of the neurotransmitter GABA, which is that calming neurotransmitter. Yoga helps to create this two-way communication channel between the mind and the body. So a lot of times I see women who've been dealing with fertility challenges for a long time, they've cut that off, right? Their body's not doing what they want it to do. And so there's not much receiving back and forth. And it's really important from a fertility standpoint that you're able to get the messages from your body. So it's not just in one way, the mind telling the body what to do, but the body can actually have some feedback about that. And then finally, for my classes, the emotional support piece is also really important. We always do a check-in. I do a lot to make it a community in the class. And people really, really value that. They're now with this group of women who's going through really similar things and are super supportive.
That's all wonderful. And I'm so glad that you're bringing light to this. And you did say something a little bit earlier I want to go back to, and that is how you took Lupron because of endometriosis. And we all know one of the side effects of Lupron is it makes you feel like you're in menopause all of a sudden. And I also take care of patients who are in the menopausal transition and they're trying to still have a baby through either their own eggs or through donor eggs. And so you've done research on menopause and yoga. So I'm super curious to hear from you as far as how yoga can help my patients who are going through this and suffering through some of the side effects of Lupron or even their own natural menopause.
The same things apply to fertility when someone is dealing with menopausal symptoms or perimenopausal symptoms. The hormonal balancing aspect is really super important. We also all know that when you're on Lupron, it's a little bit crazy making. The things that help to calm down the central nervous system and helping to calm the negative thinking and All of those things are super beneficial for menopause as well.
A lot of my patients ask me, like, is it okay for me to do yoga while I'm in my fertility treatment, whether it's IUI, IVF, or FAT cycles? What do you think?
Absolutely. On average, at any given time in my weekly classes, could be 60%, 70% of the students are doing one of those treatments. We do have to modify sometimes. And that's part of, in my classes, we do a check-in at the beginning of class. So I know going into the class what's going on with everybody. And that's one reason that I keep my class sizes reasonably small so that I can track that. So particularly we need to pay attention if somebody's on stim drugs, obviously, or just recently post-retrieval, or just immediately post-transfer for a few days post-transfer. We need to really modify things. But other than that, mostly, because my classes are super gentle anyway, we can mostly all do the same things. We do things a little more gently in the second half of the cycle than somebody who's in the first half and trying to boost their ovaries up. So occasionally there will be poses that I'm doing that I say, okay, if you're first half of the cycle, you do this. If your second half, you do something slightly different.
And how many patients, you said you try and limit it, but how many are in each cohort?
I generally limit my classes to 16.
Okay.
Because that's about how many I can keep track of it and help modify for.
Can you tell us some of your yoga secret poses? So what are the poses? And I'll sound like I'm a yoga expert when I'm not. When a patient asks me, what poses should I be doing in the first half of my cycle versus the second half?
So in the first half of the cycle, we can be, as I've said, a little more stimulative. So you could be doing things that are, like I would call them belly compression poses, maybe like a locust pose where you're lying on your belly. And we often go in and out of those poses, because when we put the compression on, the blood flow goes out of the body, out of the low belly, which is where we're resting. And then when we come out, it gets a whole fresh blood supply back in. That also works with twisting poses. So when they go into a twist, it wrings out the organs, and when they come out, they get a whole fresh blood supply and nutrients in. But those are the kinds of things that we have to be a little more careful with in the second half of the cycle, because in my classes, I always have to assume that anybody who's second half of the cycle could be in very early pregnancy or implantation stage. We do things a little more gently.
Great. And then how do you bring yoga philosophy into your yoga for fertility classes?
I do like to bring in some of the concepts that are more Eastern in nature, because some of these things are not things that we're aware of in our Western culture. I usually bring in a theme every week for my classes, and sometimes it's a theme to bring in one of these concepts that's a little more from an Eastern perspective. And I'll just give an example of one that I like to talk about, and it's a concept called Jing from Chinese medicine. Jing essentially translates as life essence. And in the Chinese medicine understanding of it, it's that we're born with a certain amount of Jing. And over our lifetimes, we use that up especially by doing stressful things, by being in difficult relationships, by having a poor diet. I tell my students, really, it's your debit card, right? You can't just keep using it, taking it out. At some point, you need to put back. Otherwise, you're going to end up in a big deficit. There are things that you can do to restore that Jing, to put it back into your Jing account. Those are things like yoga, like meditation, like walking in nature, spending time with people you love, with your pet. Those things are Jing enhancing. And if we're trying to conceive, that's a time when we really need our life essence to be strong.
I love this. When patients ask me about embryo transfer and how to prepare, I think now I'll just say, make sure your life essence is very strong. Because basically what I'm also trying to say, make sure your stress is low, you're sleeping well, you're feeling good, your relationships are sound, but truly just making sure your life essence is strong basically captures all of that. So you've just taught me something that I didn't know about. So thank you for putting it in these terms, because definitely I think that Western doctors, Western medicine practitioners, these aren't concepts that we were taught. So thank you for helping us bring the Jing back for our patients. And so I imagine that if I were to ask you this, you would also be able to teach us a great visualization or meditation for someone who is struggling. And this is, I always tell my patients, pick a mantra, but I bet you also teach this in your class. If someone's struggling, do you have a meditation or a visualization or breathing practice that you can recommend for them to try at home?
We do all of those things in my classes, and I always encourage my students to practice at home. And I would say the thing that I really most strongly encourage students to do at home is a pose called legs up the wall pose, which is just like it sounds. You're lying on your back, your legs are up the wall, so you're in an L shape. And that pose can be done really anytime during the cycle. The only time to not do it would be if you're on your period. It just doesn't feel so great to do that pose. Or if you're just post-retrieval, you're trying to get your ovaries to go down. That's also not a great time to do it. But any other time, it's a great pose to do because it's really nourishing the organs in the whole pelvic area. It's also calming just to have your head lower than the rest of your body. Generally, what I suggest is that my students do that pose for 5 minutes a day. 5 minutes, it's a small investment. It's a really powerful fertility supporting pose. And for visualization in that pose, I suggest maybe just putting your hands on your low belly. So you're having that connection, that contact. There's a lot of healing energy in your hands. So you can send healing energy into your whole reproductive area. Also, making a connection between the heart center and that low belly reproductive center is super important. Again, from the Chinese medicine tradition, they say that this heart to uterus energy channel needs to be open and energy needs to be running through that channel in order for conception. So this is also something that is not a Western idea, that the heart is important and involved in the fertility process. So when you're lying on your back with your legs up the wall, your hands resting on the low belly, and then just imagine that energy from the heart center maybe traveling down your arms and connecting into the low belly, into the reproductive center there. It's a really, really powerful practice and visualization.
I'm redesigning my exam rooms. And so what I'm thinking is that maybe I kind of position things so that legs up the wall pose could be something maybe patients do. And I'm not joking, but maybe I have an experience with this where patients do it maybe after their IUI. So after their insemination, 5 minutes, your healing hands on your belly, legs up the wall pose. And I say this because the other day I walked into an IUI room, I knocked on the door, and the patient had her legs up the wall. And I was like, oh, wow, that's a first. But now maybe she practices yoga and she knows.
She could be one of my students. I've definitely had students come and tell me that they have done that. So, yay, that would be fabulous.
So if someone is going through fertility treatment and considering yoga, like how do they start? What's a good place for them to go?
So I would really strongly recommend that they find somebody who has training in teaching yoga for fertility because it's not part of a regular yoga teacher training program. I have been running yoga for fertility teacher training programs since 2014. So there are a number of teachers trained here in the US and also outside the US to teach yoga for fertility. If there's not someone, in their area, then there are a lot of online classes that they could do that with teachers who have expertise in yoga for fertility.
And then Lynn, what if someone wants to join your in-person or online classes? How do they go about doing that?
It's all on my website, and that is yogaforfertility.net. I'm also on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. So they certainly should be able to find me, and I would love to have them join my online classes. I'm actually just about to start a new session.
Wonderful. So tell us more about the sessions.
So I run my classes usually in 8-week sessions. So they're not drop-in classes because I'm trying to create that safe space, that space of community within the class. So I start usually an 8-week session, sometimes 6 to 8 weeks, but they can join that. I also offer my classes on demand. If they're not able to make the class schedules for the online classes or the in-person classes here in Seattle, they get the recordings of the classes each week. I'm also working on membership program for my website. So that would be a place where they could go and just let's say, find a little 20-minute video on if I'm first half of my cycle or if I'm prepping for an FET cycle, a little more specific to what they're doing.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for bringing all of these options to patients everywhere, because I imagine people are busy, they're working, and they might want to join a class. They just don't have the time. So that's great that there are so many options out there for patients to do yoga for fertility. Is there anything else you want to share with our audience today?
There are a few things that I see pretty frequently that I see as obstacles that my students are dealing with. And they are things that yoga can help with. And often there are things like overthinking the process, trying to apply their normal analytical planning, organizing, micromanaging skills to this fertility process. And those skills have gotten them to where they are in their career. So a lot of my students are really type A, right? But those skills work really well in a linear process. And this, as we know, fertility process is non-linear. It doesn't go in a nice straight line, and more thinking and more researching is generally not that helpful. So these are things that yoga can help shift our mindset around it to one where instead of this is something being we're trying to achieve this pregnancy, that actually what we're trying to do is receive it. And that's a very different mindset and a very different way to approach it. So these are things where I think bringing a yoga practice in can be super helpful to shift.
Oh, that's so fascinating. So I have many mantras and sayings, and just to help me with my daily life because of the amount of, you can imagine I take care of a lot of people who are under stress. And one of them is, if you believe it, you can achieve it. So I need to change that for me in my life in terms of like accomplishments and projects and inventions and stuff like that. Like I am constantly trying to innovate. But when it comes to baby making, I agree. It should be, if you believe it, you should receive it.
I love it.
I think that that resonates so much with me. So thank you for sharing that with us.
That's beautiful. I might borrow your mantra from you with that little change.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining me. What a delight. I'm so glad that the universe brought you into my life so that your wisdom can then be imparted on so many patients out there all over the world who are struggling. Just one last question. How do you stay, aside from being active doing yoga, how do you stay so fit and healthy?
Honestly, it's yoga. I do yoga and I walk. Those are generally the recommendations that I give to my students also when they're trying to conceive, is that they walk and they do their yoga practice and not do things that are too strenuous exercise-wise. I get pushback on this a lot, but because even very strenuous exercise is Jing depleting, can be, especially if we're under a lot of stress. So that's what I tell them to do, and that's what I do.
Excellent. Awesome. Okay. Thank you again. Have a lovely day.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amy.
Thank you so much for listening and making the Egg Whisperer Show a part of your weekly routine. To find show notes and a full transcript for this episode, visit dramy.org and look under the blog tab. While you're there, you can find a link for the Egg Whisperer newsletter, which keeps you in the know about fertility news. You can also find Dr. Amy and the Egg Whisperer Show on YouTube, Instagram, or Facebook. If you'd like to learn even more, Dr. Amy offers classes at the Egg Whisperer School, eggwhispererschool.com, or you can request a consultation on dramy.org. Thank you so much for tuning in and for sharing the Egg Whisperer Show with others. Keep sparkling and have a great day.